She loved a king who chose to believe a lie over the woman kneeling at his feet. Evelina Ashmore gave him everything: her loyalty, her healing hands, her whole heart, and he repaid her with chains and darkness. But here's what Darius Vale never understood about the woman he broke. Some people don't shatter when you throw them into the dark. Some people learn to see in it. This is not a story about a man who made a mistake. This is the story of what happens when the wrong woman survives. Drop your city name below and stay until the end. You'll want to witness every second of what comes next. The morning Evelina Ashmore's world ended, the sky over Blackthorn Hollow was the color of old iron. She noticed that the sky. She had always noticed things other people didn't bother with. It was the healer in her, that particular way of watching the world for signs of what was coming. The bruised color pressing down over the castle's black spires. The way the wind had no warmth in it, even though the calendar said full summer. The silence in the corridors that wasn't the silence of peace, but the silence of people holding their breath. She had been awake since before dawn, as she usually was, grinding dried thorn root in the small stone alcove off the main healing chamber where she kept her private stores. Her hair was loose, she hadn't had time to braid it yet, and there was already a smear of something dark along the inside of her left wrist from the poultice she'd been preparing for one of the elder packmen who'd taken a wound 2 weeks back that refused to close. The wound troubled her, not because it was beyond her skill, but because it kept pulling back open at night when the old man slept, and she had begun to wonder if something in the castle itself was working against healing. She had thought that was a strange thought. Now she understood it was simply accurate. The door to the chamber opened without a knock. 2 of the king's guards stood in the frame. Not the regular rotation. She knew those men, had stitched more than a few of them back together over the years. These were Kael and Dorin, the 2 who answered directly to the Alpha King and no one else. Their faces were flat in the particular way of men who have been given an order they don't intend to question. Healer Ashmore. Kael's voice had no inflection at all. The king requests your presence in the main hall, immediately. She set down the grinding stone. The thorn root powder dusted her fingers gray. I'm in the middle of a preparation. He said immediately. She looked at them for a moment. She was not a woman who frightened easily. You couldn't be. Not in her position, not in a kingdom where half the injuries she treated came from the Alpha King's own punishments. But something moved through her chest then, something cold and formless that she would have identified in another person as dread. She wiped her hands on the work cloth, finger by finger. Give me a moment to cover the stores. Doran stepped fully into the room. Now, healer. She left the thorn root uncovered. The main hall of Blackthorn Hollow Castle was a place designed to make you feel small. Darius Vale had not built it. He had inherited it from his father, and his father from his, but he had understood its architecture in a way that suggested he would have built the exact same thing if given the choice. The ceilings were vaulted black stone. The torches burned low and orange, set in iron brackets shaped like open wolf jaws. The long floor was pale granite veined with gray, polished to the point where you could see your own reflection walking toward you if you looked down, which most people did, because the hall had a tendency to make you want to lower your eyes. Evelina did not lower her eyes. Darius Vale stood at the far end of the hall in front of the carved stone throne, which meant he had not yet sat in it, which meant this was not yet formal. That was the only thing she registered as a mercy before she registered everything else. He was a large man. That was the honest first description of him. Large in the way that Alpha Kings were bred to be, thick through the shoulder and chest, with hands that looked like they could close around a man's skull if the occasion demanded. His hair was dark, and his jaw was the kind that seemed permanently set, like a door that had been closed for so long the frame had grown around it. He had eyes the color of amber held up to firelight, and she had once, in another life, it felt like, spent considerable time thinking those eyes were beautiful. Right now those eyes were on her, and they were not beautiful. They were the eyes of a man who had already decided something and was now simply executing the decision. She noticed 3 other things in rapid succession. First, the hall was full. Not just guards, full. Pack members of varying ranks standing along the walls, seated on the stone benches, crowded near the back in the particular configuration of people who had been summoned to witness something rather than participate in it. Second, Celine Voss stood 3 steps to the right of the throne, wearing a dress the color of deep wine that cost more than most pack families saw in a full season. She had the posture of a woman who was both at ease and on a stage, which was a combination Evelina had always found worth watching carefully. Third, there were more guards near the walls than usual, not on patrol, positioned. Evelina kept walking. Her healer's mind was already doing what it always did in a crisis, taking inventory, noting exits, assessing threats, cataloging the temperature of the room, while the rest of her was catching up to what her body already knew. Something had been decided. She was the last person in this room to learn what it was. She stopped at the appropriate distance from the throne and did not bow. Healers of her rank did not bow to the Alpha King. It was an old custom, one of the few that protected the sanctity of the healing role, the acknowledgement that a healer's value lay in her independence rather than her submission. She had always believed Darius understood and respected that custom. She saw from the look on his face that she had been wrong about that too. Evelina Ashmore. His voice filled the hall without effort. Not because he was shouting, he wasn't. Because the hall was built for his voice, and he had been using it in this specific way his entire life. You've been summoned to answer a matter of significant concern to this pack. I'm here, she said. Flat. No question in it, no tremor. She would not give the room a tremor. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through those amber eyes, something she might once have called conflict. And then he looked at Celine. Celine stepped forward. The wine-colored skirts whispered against the granite. 3 nights ago, Celine said, and her voice was something else entirely from Darius's. It was smooth and precisely calibrated, a voice that knew exactly how much force to use on which syllables. I discovered documents in my personal chambers, documents that do not belong to me. She paused. Evelina had seen wolves pause before a strike, and it looked exactly like that. Documents in Healer Ashmore's hand, detailing the movements of the Alpha King, his daily schedule, his private routes, the rotation of his personal guard, the kind of information that would be of great value to someone who wished to use it against him. The room made a sound, not loud, a collective intake and release, the sound of many people adjusting to what they were being told. Evelina said nothing, not yet. Furthermore, Celine continued, and something behind her eyes glittered like a blade wiped almost clean. The documents contain references to correspondence with the Silverfang borderlands, proof of contact with enemies of Blackthorn Hollow, an arrangement. She let the words settle. For information exchanged in return for position, in the new order she apparently believed was coming. The room's sound this time was sharper. Someone near the back said something low that Evelina couldn't make out. She looked at Darius. He was watching her. Not with rage. That was the part that cut deepest, that she would keep returning to in the months that came after, in the dark, in her own mind. He was not looking at her with the heat of a man in the grip of fury. He was looking at her with the hollow, settled expression of a man who had already completed his grief and was now on the other side of it. A man who had decided. That's a lie, Evelina said. Simple, clear. The way she said it was the way she said everything. Without decoration, the way you state the location of a wound before treating it. Celine's mouth curved. Those documents exist, Darius said. They may exist. That doesn't mean I wrote them. Your hand can be copied, she said. I'm a healer in this castle. My hand appears on records, on treatment logs, on supply requests. Anyone with access to those documents and sufficient motivation could study my script and replicate it. Anyone who spent the better part of 2 years in close proximity to me and my work would know exactly how to do it. She did not look at Celine when she said it. She looked at Darius. Something moved in his face. A shadow, gone in a moment. You're saying she fabricated them. His voice was entirely level. I'm saying I have never had contact with the Silverfang borderlands. I have never documented your movements for any purpose outside of the healing duty that requires me to know your schedule. I have never negotiated anything with anyone for position or advantage, because I have never needed to. She held his gaze. You know what I am, Darius. You have known me for 11 years. You know exactly what I am. The use of his name without title moved through the room like a stone through still water. She saw it register on the faces nearest to her. She kept her eyes on his. For a moment, one moment, she thought she saw him. Not the Alpha King, not the stone jaw and the settled hollow eyes, and the performed certainty of a man whose position required him to never appear uncertain. She thought she saw the man she had met 11 years ago at the edge of a winter forest, injured and too stubborn to admit the severity of it, bleeding through his left side while he tried to convince her it was nothing. She had stitched 7 inches of torn muscle that afternoon while he gritted his teeth and stared at the tree line and did not make a sound. She had thought then that she was seeing the truest version of him, a man with enormous capacity for pain and an equal capacity to pretend it didn't exist. She understood now what that really was. "The documents have been verified," he said, "by 3 senior council members." Then the council verified what they were shown. That's not the same as it being the truth. "Evelina, tell me you know this is wrong." Her voice dropped, just low enough that it was almost only for him. Almost. "Tell me you know who I am." 11 years, Darius. 11 years, and I have been nothing but faithful to this pack, to this kingdom, to... She stopped. She could feel the thing behind her sternum starting to crack, and she pressed against it, hard. Not here. Not in front of Celine and the watching room and the guards posted along the walls. "You know this is wrong." He looked at her for a long moment. "The evidence. Tell me." 2 words. Stripped of everything but the asking, the silence stretched. Celine was watching from the edge of her vision with an expression that was just barely keeping itself below visible satisfaction. Around the hall, packmates who had eaten food Evelina had provided, been healed by her hands, watched her walk these corridors for a decade. Every single one of them was watching, and not one was speaking. "The evidence is sufficient," Darius Vale said, "for charges of sedition against the Alpha King and collusion with known enemy territories." The crack behind her sternum went all the way through. She did not let it show. "Then you've made your choice," she said. "You'll be remanded to the lower cells while the matter is fully investigated." Lower cells. Not even the holding chambers where accused pack members waited in discomfort but relative safety. The lower cells, below the castle's foundation, carved directly from the hill's bedrock, where the worst offenders were placed, where the ones who were meant to disappear went. She had treated 3 men who came out of the lower cells in 11 years. She had not been able to fully restore any of them. She held herself very still. "On whose word?" she said, and her voice was the same flat precision, the same quality of a healer naming a wound rather than a woman falling to pieces inside it. "You're sending your Luna to the lower cells on the word of a woman who has been in this castle 8 months, and who has spent most of those 8 months looking for a way to be standing exactly where I'm standing." Celine's chin came up. "Careful what you call me," Evelina said to her then, and the sound of it was quiet and very cold and entirely unlike anything she had said before. "The title of Luna in this kingdom is not a gift he gave you. It's not a position to step into because the woman who actually built it is out of the way. Whatever you have planned, whatever architecture you have built to get to this moment, I want you to understand something." She looked at Celine directly and held the look. "I see the whole of it, even now. And so will everyone else, eventually." Celine smiled, fully this time, showing her teeth. "Take her," Darius said. The guards came. Kyle and Doran were already close. They had been close since they came for her in the healing chamber, which meant this had been arranged before she ever walked into the room. She did not struggle when their hands came down on her arms. Struggle would have been visible weakness, would have given the room something to tell itself, that she had broken, that she had proved something by breaking. She walked. She kept her spine straight and her chin level, and she walked across the pale granite floor toward the rear passage and the descent. She did not look back at Darius. She did not look back. The lower cells smelled like the inside of the earth itself. Not soil, which could smell like growth, but something below soil, something that had never known air or warmth or the possibility of either. The stone walls wept with moisture. The only light came from a single torch bracket outside the iron door of her cell, and it threw a weak orange smear across the floor that barely reached the far wall. Kyle locked the door without a word. His eyes, just before he turned away, had something in them. Not regret. Men like Kyle did not traffic in regret when they were on the king's direct order. But something, an awareness maybe, that he was participating in something that would not look clean when it was examined later. The footsteps went away. Evelina stood in the center of the cell until she could no longer hear them. Then she sat down on the floor. The stone was cold through her clothing immediately. She pressed her back against the wall, and she let herself breathe, once, twice, carefully, the way she had learned to breathe during difficult extractions when her hands needed to remain absolutely steady and everything else needed to happen somewhere internal and contained. She put her hands over her abdomen. 7 weeks. She had known for 7 weeks, and she had told no one, because 7 weeks was not a certainty, and because she had needed to understand what it meant before she handed the knowledge to anyone else. She had known who the Father was. She had thought, she had believed, in the way you believe things when the world still makes a particular kind of sense, that there would be time, that it would become something to navigate together, that it would be complicated, but not this. Not this. The child moved, or she imagined it did, which at 7 weeks was perhaps the same thing. She pressed her hands flat and breathed. Survival, she thought, has a very short list of actual requirements. Everything else, the dignity, the position, the careful architecture of a life built around usefulness and value. Everything else was secondary. The list was short: warmth, water, food, time. She was in a cold place with no food and no water, and the only time she had was the time someone above her decided to allow her to keep. That was the honest accounting of where she was. She was very good at honest accounting. She began, very quietly and very deliberately, to study the cell. The stone walls were old, older than the castle above, which meant they predated Darius's family line entirely, which meant they had been built to different specifications and potentially by different hands. Old stonework had patterns, weaknesses built in through time and water and settling. She ran her fingers along the wall beside her, pressing methodically, the way she pressed along a patient's body looking for the place where the pain response changed. She found nothing in the first hour. She kept looking. Above her, she could hear, very faintly, the sounds of the castle adjusting to what had happened. Footsteps. Doors. The low, indistinct rumble of conversation spreading through corridors, the pack processing the information it had been fed. She thought about Celine's face when Darius said, "Take her." The particular quality of satisfaction in it, not triumphant, which would have been visible and therefore politically unwise, just settled. The expression of someone who has placed all their pieces correctly and is watching the board resolve. She thought about Darius's eyes, the hollow, the already decided quality. She had replayed it twice and she stopped replaying it. The analysis of what had happened would not save her. The analysis of what could happen next might. The torch outside her door sputtered. She watched the light change through the gap under the door and noted the pattern of the sputter. Irregular, which meant the torch bracket was old and the airflow in the corridor was uneven, which meant there was a draft somewhere in the passage. A draft meant a gap somewhere. A gap meant the structure was not entirely sealed. She filed this under, possibly useful. 3 days passed in the way that days pass in darkness, not by light, but by hunger and thirst, and the slow changing of the quality of sound above her. Twice a day a guard she didn't recognize slid a container of water and a hard-baked piece of something through the slot at the door's base. She ate all of it. She understood, in the clear and undecorated way she understood things, that disgust at the quality of the food was a luxury she could not afford. She drank the water and she ate the bread and she continued her examination of the walls. On the 4th day, the torch in the corridor went out. The dark that followed was total. Not the kind of dark you encountered in a room with the curtains drawn or on a moonless night under trees. Those darknesses had a quality of almost to them, a suggestion that light existed somewhere adjacent and might return. This was the dark of something that had existed before light was a concept. It had weight and texture. It pressed. She had known patients taken by panic in such conditions. The chest seizing, the breath shortening, the mind generating threats that had no physical location and therefore couldn't be addressed. She had talked more than one person through it, voice steady, hand on the wrist, counting breath. She counted her own breath now. 1, 2, 3, 4. Not panic, not the luxury of panic. The walls were still where she had memorized them. The floor was still the same dimensions. The door was still iron and still locked. Nothing had changed except the information available to her eyes, and she had spent 4 days providing her hands with the information her eyes couldn't gather in the dark anyway. She found the loose stone on the 7th day. It was on the back wall, low. She had almost dismissed the section because it was below knee height, and she had spent the first 2 days examining the walls at standing height, looking for a seam or a weakness she could use while upright. When she began examining the lower portions methodically, she found a stone roughly the size of both her fists set together that shifted a 1/4 inch when she pressed it with both palms. A 1/4 inch was everything. She sat with her back against the opposite wall and thought it through with the same precision she used when she had a patient whose survival required her to sequence her interventions correctly and not skip steps because she was frightened or tired. If the stone moved, it had moved before, which meant it had been moved deliberately at some point, or it had shifted from years of water and settling, which meant the adjacent stones might be equally compromised. Either possibility was worth pursuing. But stone removal in a cell wall was not a quiet undertaking, and she had no way of knowing the guard schedule since the corridor beyond her door was now consistently dark and consistently silent in a way that troubled her more than the torch going out had. The silence suggested change in the castle above. She had no way of knowing what the change was, which meant she had no way of assessing the risk of making noise. She spent one day, she thought it was a day, measured it by hunger, doing nothing but listening. What she heard, on the second long listening stretch, was this: a sound somewhere deep in the stone, not from above but from below and to the left. Rhythmic, irregular but patterned, not dripping water which she had been hearing since the first day, not the natural settling sounds of old rock. Something else, something with intention in it. She pressed her ear against the back wall near the loose stone and held herself completely still. Breathing. She could hear breathing. She almost missed it against the stone sounds and the water sounds and the sounds of her own circulation, which become very audible in total silence. But it was there. The in and out cadence of an animal or a person, regular, close, on the other side of the wall. She pressed her palm flat beside the loose stone. "If you can hear me," she said very quietly, into the stone, "press on the wall." Silence. A long stretch of it. Then, one pressure, felt through her palm rather than heard, a vibration that moved through the stone like a pulse. Something was on the other side. She spent 3 more days working on the loose stone with nothing but her hands and the methodical patience of a woman who understood that the distance between survival and its alternative was almost always just the willingness to keep working at the problem in front of you. Her fingers bled. The blood dried and her fingers bled again, and she packed the wounds with dust from the floor to keep the skin from splitting further, and she kept working. The stone came free on the 10th day. What she felt through the opening was air. Air with a different quality from the cell. Cooler, moving, carrying the smell of earth and something beneath earth, something mineral and old. The passage beyond was not carved. It was natural, a cavity in the rock that the cell's builders had walled over, probably not even knowing where it led or caring, using it simply as convenient solid material for their foundation. She put her head through the opening. Dark. Still too dark to see anything, but the air moved, which meant the passage went somewhere, which was the only information that mattered. She was 7 weeks pregnant and she had been in a dungeon for 10 days, and her fingers were bloody, and she was thinner than she had been before in her adult life from the restricted food, and she had absolutely no knowledge of what was on the other side of this wall. She went through. The passage was narrow enough that she had to pull herself forward on her elbows for the first several feet, the stone pressing against her back and her chest simultaneously, the dark absolute and close. She moved without rushing. Rushing in a confined space without visibility was how you panicked, and panic was... The passage opened. Not enormously. It was not a cavern or a chamber, just a widening, enough to allow her to get to her hands and knees, and then, carefully, to a low crouch. She stayed still. The air moved from her left. She moved left. She heard them before she saw them. 2 voices, low, speaking in a dialect she didn't recognize at first, and then, slowly, resolved. Not the speech of Blackthorn Hollow, not the dialect of any of the pack territories she knew. Something older, more gutted consonants, longer vowel sounds, the cadence of a language that had been spoken in cold places for a very long time. Light appeared. Not torchlight, something steadier, a pale greenish white that she associated with certain bioluminescent mineral compounds she had read about but never handled. It came through a crack in the rock to her left, and it gave enough illumination to see, in silhouette, 2 figures sitting on the passage floor. They had heard her. Of course they had. Their senses were sharper than hers in ways she could not fully imagine. One of them was already turning toward her before she had fully registered the light. The figure that turned was large as Darius, possibly larger, with a quality of contained power and even the sitting position that she recognized immediately as Lycan rather than standard pack shifter. Something about the density of it, the particular way the body held itself even at rest, as if every muscle were perpetually half prepared for a change that might come at any moment. The face was angular and scarred along the jaw and the eyes, even in the dim pale light were the light gray of quartz. "You're the healer," he said. Not a question. His accent was the gutted consonant version of the dialect she had been parsing, and his voice was very quiet, almost conversational, which she understood to mean he was capable of this quiet in any circumstance, and that it cost him nothing. "Yes," she said, "we've been waiting for you to find the wall." She looked at him. At the second figure, a woman, she could tell now, compact and dark-haired with a blade visible at her hip. At the pale light. At the passage behind her, which she would not be able to fit back through quickly if she needed to. "Why?" she said. "Because what's happening in the castle above us is going to kill you if you stay in that cell." His gray eyes moved to her abdomen and back to her face, without judgment, without commentary, registering the information the way she might register a patient's condition. Accurate, direct, no wasted expression. And because Blackthorn Hollow's healer being alive matters more than Blackthorn Hollow's healer being here. "Who sent you?" she said. "No one sent us." A pause. "We came because of what's coming. What Celine Voss is, what she's been, is bigger than a mistress with ambition. We've been watching this kingdom for 2 years. He looked at her steadily. "We need you to trust that, and we need you to do it now, because the passage we came through collapses in the next few hours, and after that, there's no way out that doesn't go back through that cell." She looked at him. She thought about Darius's hollow eyes. She thought about the sound of the lock on the iron door. She thought about the shape pressing her hands flat against the stone wall, listening for a sign that something alive was on the other side. She thought about the child. "Show me the way out," she said. He stood. He was in fact larger than Darius, and the scar along his jaw was old and had not been healed by a skilled hand, which meant he came from somewhere that did not have easy access to healing skill, which told her at least one thing about where they were going. "My name is Koran," he said. "You'll want to remember that." "Evelina," she said. "I know." He turned toward the far end of the passage where the air moved strongest. "Stay close. The footing's uneven for the first quarter mile." She followed him. Behind her, somewhere above, through 10 feet of stone in the cell floor and the castle's foundation, and all the weight of a kingdom arranged against her, she heard a sound. Distant, muffled almost to nothing by the rock. An explosion, deep, rolling. The passage shook once. Dust fell from the ceiling in a thin stream. The pale light flickered, and then, with the sound of something enormous and structural giving way in the darkness, the section of wall she had just come through collapsed entirely, sealing the cell and everything she had been, and the woman who had trusted the wrong man, behind several tons of ancient stone. She did not stop walking. The passage ran for what felt like a mile, but was probably half that. Distance in the dark, with uneven footing, and the particular quality of attention required when your body was carrying something you could not afford to damage, stretched every yard into something longer. Corin moved ahead of her with the economy of a man who had done this specific thing before, not rushing but not accommodating either, and she understood that was correct. He was not her escort. He was her exit, and exits didn't wait. The woman, she had not yet given a name, moved behind Evelina. Not crowding, just present. The kind of presence that meant something in Evelina's peripheral awareness every time she slowed or caught her footing on the uneven floor. A marker. A boundary. She filed this under, not yet trust, but not yet threat either. The pale light Corin carried was a stone, she saw when she finally had enough angles on it, a flat piece of mineral the size of his palm that produced the greenish-white glow from its own surface, with no flame or fuel she could identify. It threw enough light to navigate by without throwing enough to be visible from a distance. Whoever had given it to him had thought about the problem of moving through dark spaces without advertising movement. That was the kind of detail that told you something. They surfaced through a crack in the hillside that the forest had been pressing against for long enough that the roots had worked into the stone on both sides. Evelina came through last and stood for a moment with her face tilted up. The sky was pre-dawn gray, and the air had the cold weight of a night that hadn't finished yet. She breathed it, the first real air she had taken in 10 days, and she let herself have exactly one breath of something that was not quite relief and not quite grief, and was probably both at once. Then she moved. They had horses. 4 of them, waiting in the trees with a 4th member of whatever this party was. A young man, narrow through the shoulder, with the watchful stillness of someone trained to wait without fidgeting. He looked at her once and then at Corin, and Corin shook his head in the smallest possible way, and the young man stopped looking. "How far are we riding?" she said. 3 days, Corin said. He was already at his horse. "If we don't stop." "I'll need stops." He looked at her. The gray eyes moved again briefly and came back to her face. "Every 4 hours, he said. 10 minutes. If pursuit shows up, that window closes." Understood. She mounted without assistance. She noted the quality of the horse. Strong, deep in the chest, not the showy breeding that Blackthorn Hollow's stables favored, but the practical kind built for endurance over appearance. Someone had thought about this ride specifically. Someone had thought about a lot of things. She decided she would ask about the someone when they were far enough from the castle that the conversation wouldn't cost them time they didn't have. They rode north. For the first 2 hours she said nothing, and neither did anyone else. The forest thickened around the narrow trail, and the pre-dawn dark gave way to a gray light that filtered through canopies so dense it felt like riding underwater. Corin set the pace. Steady, ground covering, not punishing. The woman rode to Evelina's left. The young man took the rear. She was thinking about the explosion. The sound that had reached her through 10 feet of stone, rolling, structural. "What collapsed?" she said. Corin didn't look back. "The lower cell block. South section." "How?" A pause. "We encouraged it. People were in those cells." "2, he said. "Both moved before we set the charge. One of them is riding behind you right now." She processed this. The woman to her left, she looked, and the woman met the look with the flat directness of someone who knew exactly what was being assessed, and had opinions about being assessed but was choosing to let it happen anyway. "You were in the lower cells," Evelina said. 4 weeks, the woman said. Her accent was the same dialect as Corin's, the gutted consonants, the long vowels. Her voice had a dryness to it that was not unfriendliness, but was also not warmth. "Longer than you." "What were you charged with?" "Breathing in the wrong kingdom." She turned her gaze back to the trail ahead. "Same as you, more or less." Evelina looked at the back of Corin's broad shoulders for a moment. "You said Selene Voss is more than a mistress with ambition," she said. "Tell me what that means." "Later." "Now." He glanced back this time. Something shifted in the gray eyes, a recalibration, she thought, of the category she was being placed in. She held the look without expression. "Later," he said again, but differently. The word had changed shape. She let it go. For now. On the second day they came out of the dense forest into open hill country. Long slopes of yellow-brown grass with stone outcroppings along the ridgelines and the sky enormous and pale overhead. It was the kind of landscape that made you visible, which meant it was the kind of landscape where you moved fast or you moved clever, and Corin chose fast without being told to. The pace increased. Evelina's body registered the change and adapted. She was already thinner than she'd been before the dungeon, already running on less than she would have prescribed for any patient in her condition, and she understood with the clinical precision of a healer assessing a case that was also herself that the calculation was, survive this exposure first, address the deficits when you have shelter to address them in. Survive first. Address deficits second. It was, stripped of everything else, a fairly clean operating principle. They made camp on the second night in a shallow hollow between 2 ridgelines where the wind was blocked and the fire could be kept small. Evelina ate the food the young man cooked. Salt meat, hard grain cake, dried something that might have been fruit, without comment on its quality, because her opinion of its quality was not relevant, and she had long since arrived at the conclusion that opinion without utility was weight you couldn't afford to carry. Corin sat across the fire from her. He had not said more than was necessary for the entire second day, and she had matched him, because she recognized when a person was processing something and pushing would only produce deflection. Now he looked at her across the low flame with the steady quality of a man who had decided to be direct. Celine Voss is not pack-born, he said. She had suspected this. She did not say so. She's an operative, he continued, out of a faction in the Silverfang borderlands, not the Silverfang Empire itself, a splinter faction that's been working the outlying kingdoms for the past decade. They find unstable courts. They place people. They drain resources and loyalty until the kingdom is weak enough to absorb. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. Blackthorn Hollow was identified 3 years ago. You were identified as the primary obstacle. The fire popped. The wind moved over the hollow's edge above them without reaching down. Me, she said. A healer with 11 years of earned loyalty from the pack, direct access to the Alpha King, and the specific kind of credibility that doesn't come from a title but from consistent competence. He said it without flattery, which was the only way it could have been said without her dismissing it. Getting rid of you was step 1. Replacing the king's trust with Celine's influence was step 2. The rest of it follows. How long have you known? Confirmed knowledge. 8 months. Suspected longer. And you waited until I was in a dungeon to collect me. The young man across the fire shifted slightly. The woman, whose name was Vera, Evelina had learned, in the same minimum exchange way she'd learned everything else, looked at the middle distance with the expression of someone who had already had this argument internally. Corinne held her gaze. We needed proof the faction would expose itself. Celine moving against you directly, using the council, using the king, that was the exposure. We have the pattern now, not just the suspicion. A beat. I understand that doesn't address the fact that you spent 10 days in a dungeon. No, she said, it doesn't. She looked at him for a moment longer. But it's an honest answer, which is more than I've been given by most people in the last month, so we'll move forward. He nodded. Once. Minimal. Where are we going? She said. Silverfang territory. The true Silverfang Empire, not the faction. There's a distinction and it matters. The faction is what Blackthorn Hollow is dealing with. The Empire is something else. Something else, she repeated. You'll need to see it to understand what I mean by that. He seemed to consider for a moment whether to continue. They've been waiting for someone with your specific skill set, your knowledge of pack medicine, the herb routes, the border healing traditions. There's no one in the Empire who has that combination from a living practitioner. He met her eyes squarely. What I'm offering you is not sanctuary. It's not a safe place to wait out the politics of what's happening to Blackthorn Hollow. What I'm offering you is a position, real work, the kind that will ask more of you than anything you've done before. She looked at the fire. She thought about a healing chamber with her stores organized the way she'd organized them. She thought about the elder Pac-Man's wound that had kept reopening. She thought about 11 years of knowing the names of every pack member she'd ever treated, and the particular satisfaction of that knowing, the texture of a life built in one place among people you'd earned. She thought about Iron Doors and Total Dark and Darius Vale's hollow amber eyes already decided. Some losses you had to account for honestly before you could move past them. The accounting of this one would take more than 2 days on horseback. She understood that. She set it aside in the specific internal location where she had always placed things that required processing that she could not currently afford. What does the position involve? She said. Coran looked at her across the fire, and something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of acknowledgement, the recognition of a quality he had been assessing for. Training, he said. First, then whatever you decide to build from it. On the third morning, they crossed the border. There was no marker for it, no wall or post or formal demarcation, but the landscape changed. Not dramatically, not the way a map would have you believe borders work, but in the accumulation of small things. The stone of the outcroppings was a different color, grayer, with a metallic quality and certain light. The trees that appeared as they descended into lower country had bark with a silver cast that she had never encountered. The air itself carried something different, harder, cleaner, with an edge to it that she associated with high altitude despite the fact that they had been descending. And then she heard the wolves. Not howling, not the territorial or distress calls she knew from Blackthorn Hollow's pack. Something else. A sound that was partly howl and partly something that had no name in her experience, lower and more complex, carrying harmonics she hadn't thought wolf vocal cords could produce. It moved through the trees from multiple directions, not converging, not threatening, but aware, noticing. Corin rode without changing pace. Vera and the young man, Fen, she had finally learned, just Fen, were equally unchanged, which meant this was expected, which meant they were already known. She held herself steady, and she listened, and she filed away every detail of what she heard. The settlement appeared over the next ridge. She had expected something defensive, a fortress, perhaps, or a walled encampment. What she saw instead was a city, not large, not ornate, but unmistakably intentional, built along the contours of the hillside with a precision that spoke of engineering rather than improvisation, layered up the slope in tiers with a logic she could almost read from the outside. Stone structures, silver gray, with the same metallic quality as the outcroppings. Movement everywhere, purposeful, the movement of a place that was working rather than waiting. And the people moving were larger than standard pack. Lycan, fully, unmistakably, in the way she had recognized it in Quran from the first moment in the underground passage. The particular density, the contained readiness. Every single person she could see from this ridge carried themselves with the specific quality of something that had decided at some foundational level that it did not need to be afraid. She had never seen that many people moving through a space without a visible hierarchy of fear, without the low-grade wariness that pervaded even the highest-ranking members of Blackthorn Hollow's court, the awareness of where the Alpha King was, what his mood was, whether today was a day to be visible or invisible. She did not know exactly what she was looking at. She understood, with the healer's instinct for identifying the critical variable in any situation, that it was important. They were met at the lower tier of the settlement by a woman who appeared to be in late middle age, and who was the first person Evelina had encountered in 3 days who looked at her not as a package being delivered, but as a person arriving somewhere. She had silver-streaked hair pulled back without ceremony, and the kind of face that had been thinking hard for a long time and didn't bother to hide it. "Evelina Ashmore," the woman said. "Yes." "I'm Marta. I run the training compound." She looked at Evelina with the direct assessing quality of a woman whose assessments were generally accurate. "How are you standing?" "Well enough." "That's not what I asked." A pause. The honest accounting, depleted, thinner than optimal, running on managed adrenaline and the specific willpower of someone who has decided to survive a thing before they've decided what the next thing is. "Not as well as I'll be in 2 weeks," she said. "Better than I was 10 days ago." Marta looked at her for another moment, then nodded. "We'll address the physical first," she said. "The rest of it after." She turned, already walking. "Corin will show you your quarters. You eat before you sleep. That's not a suggestion. Tomorrow you'll meet the council and we'll discuss what comes next." She paused and looked back over her shoulder with the expression of someone adding a detail they've been waiting to deliver. "Your son will be healthy. We have healers here who've managed more complicated circumstances." The words moved through Evelina like something released from a long-held pressure. Her expression did not change. She would not let it change here, in the open, in front of people she had known for 3 days, but her hand, at her side, pressed flat against her abdomen for just a moment. "Thank you," she said. Marta had already turned away. Corin led her up through the settlement's lower tier, and the details accumulated around her. The materials of construction, the arrangement of structures for function over display, the age visible in the stone that spoke of generations rather than decades. She was cataloging it the way she cataloged everything, not performing observation, actually seeing. "How long has this place been here?" she said. "Long enough that most of the people who built it have great-grandchildren living in it," Corin said. "And the faction, Selane's faction, they don't know about it. They know the Silverfang Empire exists. They believe it's fragmented, weak." He stopped at a door set into the hillside itself, stone-framed, heavy, with a latch that looked simple and was probably not. "They're wrong about a number of things." He opened the door. The room inside was small and clean and had a window cut in the stone that looked out over the lower settlement toward the hills. There was a bed, a table, a washstand with actual water in the basin. She stepped inside. "Evelina." She looked back. Corin stood in the door with the gray quartz eyes steady on her. What happened to you in Blackthorn Hollow? What Darius Vale did? That's going to try to become the story you tell yourself about who you are. I've seen it with others who came here with similar circumstances. What I've also seen is that it doesn't have to. A pause. What you decide to do with the next 3 years is going to matter. Not to Blackthorn Hollow, not to the Alpha King, to the thing you're building here. She looked at him for a moment. Close the door on your way out, she said. He did. She stood in the center of the room for 30 seconds. Then she went to the window and looked out at the Silverstone city built into the hillside and the wolves moving through it with their particular quality of having decided not to be afraid, and she let herself understand for the first time and fully that she was not going back. Not to the healing chamber, not to the organized stores and the familiar corridors and the 11 years of careful building. Not to the man who had looked at her across a granite floor with hollow amber eyes and said, "The evidence is sufficient." She pressed her fingers to the window stone. Cold, smooth, dense, different from the stone she knew. That was accurate. She was somewhere different, and if the walls were going to be different, and the stone was going to be different, and the people were going to be different, and the entire architecture of survival was going to have to be rebuilt from a foundation that had been demolished by a single betrayal, then she would rebuild it. She would build it better. She would build it into something so thoroughly not what had been done to her that the woman who had knelt in that granite hall and said, "Tell me you know this is wrong," would become someone she could look at from a distance, recognize, understand, not diminish, but would not ever again be. She turned from the window and went to the washstand and began, with steady, methodical hands, to clean the dried blood from her fingers. Outside, somewhere on the hillside above her, a wolf sent a long harmonic note into the late afternoon air, and it had no fear in it at all, and something in her chest, something she had been holding shut since the iron door closed behind her in the dark, cracked open just enough to breathe. She was still breathing when the sound faded. She was still standing. That for now was enough to build from. 3 years moved through Evelina Ashmore the way rivers move through stone. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the kind of patience that doesn't need to be dramatic because it has already decided what it's going to accomplish. The first year was the hardest because it was the year of unlearning. Not forgetting, she had never believed in the utility of forgetting, which was something her mother had said to her when she was 7 years old, and which she had tested against enough real experience to confirm as accurate. But unlearning was different from forgetting. Forgetting was passive. Unlearning required you to locate every assumption you had built your practice on, hold it up against a different light, and decide with cold honesty what remained useful and what had simply been the habits of a woman who had never been required to survive without the structure she'd grown up inside. She unlearned the deference. That was the first and most necessary thing, not the respect for competence, that she kept, refined it actually, sharpened it to a point that had no softness in it at all, but the specific posture of a healer in a court system, the careful management of visibility, the instinct to make herself smaller in rooms where alpha power was being performed. She cut that out of herself the way she cut damaged tissue from a wound. Not because it had been wrong, exactly. Because it was no longer suited to what she was becoming. Marta did most of the cutting. Marta had a way of identifying the exact location of a limitation and pressing on it without announcing that she was pressing. She would give Evelina a task. Lead the morning assessment of 12 trainees, negotiate a supply dispute between 2 senior warriors who both outranked her by every metric that had mattered in Blackthorn Hollow, and then she would watch with the stillness of someone who had seen 100 versions of this particular struggle and found none of them boring. When Evelina hesitated, when she performed the old instinct of waiting for someone with more visible authority to make the final call, Marta would simply wait longer, until the only option was for Evelina to make the call herself. She made a lot of bad calls in the first year. She was honest about that in the way she was honest about everything. Not with the self-flagellating honesty of someone looking for absolution, but with the clean, accurate honesty of a practitioner assessing her own outcomes. Bad call, here's why. Here's the correction, move forward. The son arrived at the end of the first year's first month. She named him Aldrich. He had dark hair and she noted this with a quality of feeling she did not fully examine for several weeks, his father's jaw. She examined that feeling when she finally had the time and internal capacity to do so, And what she found was not what she had expected. Not grief, or not only grief. Not rage, though there was some of that, quiet and load-bearing as a foundation wall. What she found mostly was a particular quality of determination that she had not previously encountered in herself, something that was not about her at all, or not primarily, something that had reorganized the hierarchy of her motivations around a single uncomplicated fact. She would not raise her son in a world that worked the way Blackthorn Hollow worked. That was the fact. Everything else was implementation. Vera, whose dryness turned out to contain a surprising amount of practical affection once it was given time to surface, took a share of Aldrich's care in the second year with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had decided a thing was necessary and was therefore doing it without ceremony. Evelina did not ask her to. Vera did not offer. It simply began happening, and they both acknowledged it with the same minimum of verbal exchange that characterized most of what worked between them. Ben, the young man from the passage, turned out to be extraordinarily gifted with the particular Lycan herb traditions that Evelina had only theoretical knowledge of. The silver root compounds, the moon petal extracts that worked differently on Lycan physiology than on standard pack biology. They spent the better part of the second year working through what each of them knew, trading knowledge across the gap between their traditions, building something out of the combination that neither of them could have built alone. He was 22 and had the specific earnestness of someone who had survived something young and come out of it with his capacity for genuine attention intact rather than hardened over. She was careful with that. She had seen what happened when that quality got used up. The combat training began at the start of the second year. She had resisted it. That was honest, not from fear of physical difficulty. She had a high tolerance for physical difficulty, had always had it. It was perhaps the one quality the dungeon had not been required to install in her because it had already been there. She had resisted it because she had understood herself, for 34 years, as a healer. Someone who came after the violence. Someone whose function was to address what violence produced, not to produce it herself. Corin had sat across from her in the training compound's planning room and listened to this without visible expression, and then said, "The woman you need to become in order to do what you're planning to do will require both. The healer and the thing that can survive in the same room as the other alphas without needing anyone to defend her." "I'm not planning anything," she said. He looked at her with the flat patience of a man who had been watching her for 2 years. She started combat training the next morning. She was not, as it turned out, a natural fighter in the way some people were naturals, the ones with the specific spatial intuition that made combat feel like a language they had always known. She was a technician. She learned the way she learned everything, through systematic acquisition and repetition and the ruthless identification of her own errors. By the end of the second year, she was competent. By the middle of the third, she was something else. Not the most powerful fighter in the Silverfang compound, not the fastest, but she had developed a quality that several of her instructors mentioned independently and which she eventually understood was the quality of someone who simply would not stop. Not stubbornness. Something colder than stubbornness. The quality of a person who had already calculated what they were willing to pay and found the number to be very high. Aldrich began to walk, then to talk, then to follow the silver wolves with the specific fearlessness of a child who had grown up among something enormous and found it entirely unremarkable. The third year was the year the intelligence started coming in. Corin had sources in Blackthorn Hollow. He had always had them. She understood now that this was part of the larger operation, the Silverfang Empire's long monitoring of the faction's movements through the outlying kingdoms. The reports arrived irregularly and were delivered to her without ceremony, placed on her table by Marta or left with Vera, because it had been established at some point without formal discussion that the intelligence about Blackthorn Hollow was hers to process. She processed it. Celine had moved quickly after Evelina's disappearance, quicker than Darius had understood, which meant he had not understood Celine at all. Not her timeline, not the depth of her operational commitment, not the fact that his utility to her had an expiration date. The pack's healing resources had been redirected, not to other healers, but simply reduced, as though the function of healing were an expense rather than an infrastructure. 3 senior pack members who had been close to Evelina had been reassigned or quietly pressured into lesser positions. The council had been restructured twice, and each restructuring had left it more homogeneous in its loyalty to Celine's faction and less capable of the kind of horizontal pressure that kept Alpha rule from becoming merely autocracy. Darius, in the reports, appeared as a man diminished, not broken, not yet, but narrowed. The intelligence described him as less present in council meetings, more prone to isolated decisions, increasingly dependent on Celine's interpretation of events. He no longer seemed to be reading directly himself. This was the architecture of what Celine had built in Blackthorn Hollow. Not a replacement of the Alpha, but a hollowing of him, a gradual removal of the sensory inputs that would have allowed him to detect the removal itself. She read these reports with her healer's precision and felt something she spent considerable time identifying. It was not satisfaction at his decline. It was not grief for it either, not anymore, not in any form she could access directly. What she felt, she finally determined, was the particular quality of recognition that comes when a diagnosis you made long ago is confirmed by the patient's subsequent presentation. She had seen what Celine was from the beginning. She had said so, in the granite hall, as clearly as she knew how. The confirmation was not a victory. It was simply accurate. On the morning of the 3-year anniversary of her arrival in the Silver Fang Empire, Marta came to her quarters before the compound's first movement and stood in the doorway with the expression of someone carrying weight they have been carrying for some time and have decided the carrying is finished. "Council meeting," Marta said. "Full council. 1 hour." She was already awake. She was usually already awake. "What's happened?" Marta looked at her for a moment with the thinking hard face that had been thinking hard for longer than Evelina had known her. "Come to the meeting," she said. The council chamber was cut directly from the rock of the hillside, which gave it the quality of having always existed, of being a place where decisions had been made since before anyone currently making them had been born. The table was long, and the people seated at it were the people who ran the Silver Fang Empire's operational infrastructure. 12 of them, and she knew all 12, had worked with most of them across 3 years, understood their competencies and their blind spots, and the specific ways each of them thought through problems. Corin was already there. He was standing, which was unusual. He looked at her when she came in, and his expression had the quality she associated with him when the information he was carrying was significant enough to require some management of how it was delivered. She sat. She waited. 3 days ago, Corin said, "we lost contact with our primary source inside Blackthorn Hollow." The room held its response. She held hers. "Lost contact how?" said one of the council members. "A man named Bren, infrastructure, competent and unsentimental." The source was extracted. Corin's voice was even. "Celine's people identified the network." He paused. 2 other secondary contacts were taken at the same time. The information they had, the intelligence we've been building about the faction's resource network, the movement patterns, the timeline for what they're planning at the Blood Moon Summit. Another pause. "We have to assume it's compromised." The Blood Moon Summit. She had known about it for 18 months, the quadrennial gathering of every Alpha ruler in the Northern Territories, the single event at which Blackthorn Hollow's decline would be visible to every power that mattered, the event that the faction had been building toward as the moment of formal consolidation, the moment at which Celine's position would be legitimized before every ranking Alpha on the continent. "How much of the operation is exposed?" she said. Corin looked at her directly. "Enough that the original plan isn't viable." "Define enough." "They know we've been monitoring them. They may know the Empire's involved." He held her gaze. "They almost certainly know you're alive." The room's quality of silence changed. She sat with that for exactly as long as it required to sit with, and then she began thinking forward. "If they know I'm alive," she said, "the summit changes." "Yes. Celine will move faster. If she believes there's a possibility of exposure at the summit, she won't wait for it to happen on the floor. She'll secure her position before it convenes." Evelina looked at the table. The calculation was assembling itself in the specific rapid way her mind had learned to work in the 3 years she had spent building it into something different. "She'll move against Darius." The silence again. Different this time. "Our assessment also," Bren said. "How long?" "Weeks. Possibly less." She looked at Corin. He was watching her with the gray quartz eyes that had, over 3 years, become one of the most reliably honest mirrors she had access to. She could see in them the thing he had not said yet and was waiting for her to identify. "You need me at the summit," she said. "I need to know if you're willing," he said. "There's a distinction. If I'm not at the summit, the Empire's position is a collection of intelligence without a face, without a narrative the other alphas can locate themselves in relation to." She heard herself saying it and understood, somewhere below the calculation, that she had been preparing for this specific conversation without knowing she was preparing for it for the better part of 3 years. And if Selena moves against Darius before the summit, there's a secondary problem. She stopped. The room waited. "Aldrich?" Marta said quietly. That was the thing that reorganized every calculation, that placed itself at the center of the operational problem and refused to be treated as peripheral because it was not peripheral. If Celine believed Evelina was alive and moving toward the summit, and if Celine also knew that Darius had a son he didn't know existed, "She'll look for him," Evelina said. Her voice was level. "If she knows I survived and she knows what I carried out of Blackthorn Hollow, she'll understand that the son is a complication. A Lycan heir with a legitimate blood claim to the Blackthorn throne is the one thing that fractures the faction's plan for the summit completely." She looked at Marta. "She'll move against Aldrich before she moves against Darius." The room was very quiet. "We have the compound's security," Vera said from the far end of the table. She had not spoken until now, and her voice had the flat quality of someone naming a fact while simultaneously working out what the fact required of them. "The compound's security was sufficient when we were the only ones who knew what was in it," Evelina said. "It isn't sufficient against a faction that has been running operations for a decade and has just learned what's here." She looked around the table, at Marta, who had met her in a lower settlement 3 years ago and asked how she was standing, at Koran, who had found her in a collapsed passage with bloody fingers, and the specific quality of a woman who had decided to survive, at Fen, who had come to this meeting because he was now senior enough to be here, and who was looking at her with his particular quality of genuine attention that she had always been careful with. She thought about the woman who had sat on a dungeon floor and pressed her hands flat and counted breath. She thought about the moment she had gone through the hole in the wall with no knowledge of what was on the other side. She thought about Aldrich's jaw, and whose jaw it was, and what it meant that the man who had put her in a dungeon had an heir he had never been told about because the only person who could have told him had disappeared into the dark. There were things she had held at a distance for 3 years because holding them at a distance had been necessary for the building. She understood now that the building was finished. What remained was the using of what had been built, and to use it she would have to pick up every single thing she had set down and carry it into a room full of Alpha Kings wearing silver armor and a crown, and the full weight of everything she had become. "I'll go to the summit," she said. No one looked surprised. That too told her something. "There's one more thing," Corin said. She looked at him. He placed a document on the table. She recognized the seal on it. Not Blackthorn Hollow, not the Silverfang Empire. Older than both. The ancient Lycan territorial covenant, the foundational law that predated every kingdom currently operating under it by several centuries. She looked at the document for a long moment. "You've been building a case," she said. "For 2 years," he said. "The evidence of Celine's faction, the unlawful imprisonment of a seated Luna, the existence of a Lycan heir." He met her eyes. "Under ancient law, all of it together constitutes grounds for a territorial claim." The room was very still. She reached out and pulled the document toward her and read it. Not quickly. She read it the way she read everything, completely, noting every specific term and its implications, mapping the architecture of what it required and what it would produce. She set it down. Outside the council chamber, somewhere in the compound, she could hear Aldrich's voice, high and clear, the specific joyful volume of a 2-year-old pursuing something on the practice ground with the fearless momentum of a child who had never been taught to make himself smaller. She picked up the document again and looked at Corin. "Teach me," she said, "everything the other alphas will need to see at that summit. Not just what I know, what I need to be." Corin looked at her across the table with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something that was neither assessment nor acknowledgement, but something in the territory between them that had no name she had encountered yet. "You already are it," he said. "You just need to let them see." She looked down at the ancient seal on the document, the obsidian wolf. The territorial covenant that had survived every kingdom that had been built over it and every kingdom that had fallen. She set the document flat on the table in front of her and pressed her palm down on it, the way she had once pressed her palm against a dungeon wall, listening for something alive on the other side. This time, she was the thing on the other side, and she was no longer listening. The weeks between the council meeting and the summit were the weeks that built the weapon. Not metaphorically. Literally, Evelina understood herself now as something being constructed toward a specific purpose, and she participated in that construction with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, the same refusal to skip steps because the steps were uncomfortable, or because the person being remade by them was herself. Corin worked her in the practice yard until the movement stopped being learned and became instinctual, until her body carried the knowledge in the specific way that meant it would be available under pressure when the thinking mind was occupied with other calculations. Marta drilled her in ancient Lycan territorial law, not the broad strokes she had read in the document, but the specific provisions, the exact language, the procedural requirements for invoking a claim before a full Alpha Council. She memorized all of it. She slept less than she should have. She spent every hour she could carve out with Aldrich, who was growing with the particular speed of a Lycan child, and who had begun, in the last month, to demonstrate the first signs of the shift, a faint silver quality to his eyes in certain light, a density of presence when he was calm, that was entirely unlike any standard pack child she had ever observed. She watched him, and she felt the calculation settle into something permanent and load-bearing in her chest. She would not fail him. That was not aspiration. That was structure. The summit was held on neutral ground, a plateau in the territorial borderlands that had been used for the quadrennial gathering for longer than any currently living Alpha could document from first-hand experience. It was 3 days' ride from the Silverfang compound, and they arrived the evening before the summit's opening session so that she would have the night to read the camp's configuration, to understand the layout of power before she walked into the center of it. What she saw from the ridge above the plateau, in the last hour of gray light before dark, was this: 43 delegations, each with their own camp section, the whole arrangement following a protocol so old it had become landscape rather than architecture. Fire circles, animal sounds, horses, the occasional wolf in shift, the smell of wood smoke and food, and the particular smell of large concentrations of dominant predators in proximity, which was something between musk and metal and the specific quality of air before a storm. Somewhere in the center section, the largest, the best positioned, the one with the most guards on its perimeter, Blackthorn Hollow's delegation had set up. She looked at it for a long time. "He's there," Corin said. He was beside her, reading the same configuration. "Arrived this morning. Celine's with him. 8 personal guards, which is double his usual count for a summit." A pause. "He knows something's off. He's running scared without knowing what he's scared of." "He knows I'm alive," she said. "Probably, if Celine told him." She told him. She was certain of it. She had spent 3 years understanding Celine's operational logic, and one of the things she understood most clearly was that Celine used Darius's emotional state as a resource. Fear made him controllable. Knowledge of Evelina's survival would have produced a specific quality of fear that Celine would have calculated as useful rather than destabilizing. She told him, and she told him I was a threat. She's been managing his response to it for weeks. Does that change your approach? She looked at Blackthorn Hollow's camp until she had seen everything she needed to see, and then she turned away from the ridge. "No," she said. The silver armor had been made in the Empire's forge by a woman named Hass, who was 70 years old and had the hands of someone who had spent 60 of those years making things that mattered. The metal was not standard silver. It was an alloy specific to the Silverfang tradition, lighter than it looked, with a surface quality that, in direct firelight, appeared almost liquid. The breastplate was engraved with the Territorial Covenant's wolf mark, which served the dual function of being genuine. She had earned the right to wear it through the document she had signed in the 3 years that preceded the signing, and of being visible from a distance, which was not a vanity consideration, but a tactical one. The crown was obsidian and silver wire, the Lycan Queen's formal headpiece, and she had worn it twice in practice and both times found it neither heavy nor comfortable, which she took to mean she was approaching it correctly, not as an adornment but as a responsibility made visible. She put it on in the pre-dawn dark on the morning of the summit's opening session. Aldrich was with Vera, back at the compound, with a full security rotation that Coran had arranged through channels she trusted entirely and had verified independently anyway, because trusting people did not require you to stop verifying. She stood in the tent and looked at herself in the surface of a polished iron plate that served as a mirror, and she took a complete accounting. She was 37 years old. She was leaner than she had been in Blackthorn Hollow, which was not a deficiency but a redistribution. 3 years of combat training and Lycan tradition physical conditioning had changed the architecture of her body into something with different priorities than the healing chamber body she had inhabited before. There was a scar along her left forearm from the second year's training that had healed clean but had healed visibly, and she had at some point stopped noticing it and now noticed it again and found she had no feeling about it in particular except a mild and accurate recognition that it was evidence of work. The woman in the polished iron was not the woman who had walked across pale granite with thornroot dust on her fingers. She was not better or worse. She was built for different work. She walked out into the pre-dawn gray and she did not look back at the tent. The summit's formal opening session convened at mid-morning with the gathering of all 43 delegations in the central pavilion, an open-sided structure the size of a great hall, supported by old timber columns, with the alpha rulers and their senior representatives arranged in a circle by territorial protocol. Evelina's delegation entered last. She had timed this, not for drama, for information. Walking in last meant she could read the room before committing to her position in it. The delegations arranged before her arrival, the faces already present, the specific configuration of attention and reaction as she crossed the pavilion's threshold. The reaction was worth the information. She watched it move through the room in a wave, starting from the delegations nearest the entrance and traveling the full circle in the time it took her to walk 20 feet. The silence that replaced conversation. The specific quality of attention that is different from the attention a powerful person receives. Something more primitive, more instinctual, the response of a room full of dominant predators, encountering something they had not fully categorized and were therefore processing with the parts of themselves that operated below calculation. She looked straight ahead. She walked to the Silverfang delegation's position in the circle with the specific quality of movement that Corin had spent 3 months making her understand was not performed confidence but actual confidence, which looked different from the outside because it had nothing to prove and therefore moved without the stiffness of performance. She took her position. She did not look for Darius. She would find him when she was ready. The summit's presiding elder, a man named Cass, ancient and dry, and possessed of the patient authority of someone who had been performing this function at enough summits that he had stopped finding any of it surprising, began the formal proceedings with the territorial roll. Each delegation acknowledged in order. Silverfang Empire, Cass said. Present, Corin said beside her. Represented by. Queen Evelina Ashmore, Corin said. Of the Silverfang Empire. Luna of the Blackthorn Hollow bloodline, mother of the Lycan heir. The silence this time was different, total. The kind of silence that happens when a room of 43 delegations all stop breathing at once. She looked up. She found Darius across the circle the way you find a specific instrument in an orchestra, not by searching, but by the particular quality of its sound cutting through everything else. He was standing. He had been seated when she entered. She knew because she had taken the room's inventory at the threshold, and now he was standing with his hands at his sides, and his face had the specific quality of a man in the first seconds of something catastrophic, when the mind is still trying to run the event backward and make it not have happened. He was thinner than she remembered. There were lines around his eyes that had not been there 3 years ago, and his jaw had the set of something that had been clenched for so long it had forgotten how to release. He was still large, still unmistakably alpha, but the hollowness she had seen in his eyes in the granite hall had deepened in 3 years into something that looked less like a decision and more like a wound. She noted all of this. She noted it with the healer's precision, and she felt what she felt about it with the specific quality of feeling that had replaced the sharper grief of the first year. Not cold exactly, not the absence of feeling, but the feeling of someone who has assessed a damage and understood that the damage is too old now for certain treatments to be relevant. She looked at Darius Vale, and she did not look away. He took a step forward. Selena's hand came to his arm, not grabbing, touching, the specific touching of a woman who had spent 3 years learning exactly how much pressure to apply to that particular arm at that particular moment. Evelina saw it. She saw Darius feel it. She saw the half second of response where the old conditioning ran its sequence in him, the managed pause, the reconsideration. Then he stepped forward anyway. Celine's hand dropped. Evelina. His voice carried the hall without effort, the way it always had. But the quality was different from the last time she had heard it. Not the hollow, settled certainty of a man who had decided. Something rawer, something that had been under pressure for a long time, and was right now exceeding the structural capacity of the container. Alpha King. Her voice was equal volume, equal carry, entirely level, a title, not a name. The difference registered in every ear in the hall. He stopped halfway across the circle. 42 delegations watched without pretending not to watch. "You're alive," he said. "Yes." They said... He stopped, processed. Celine said you'd... He stopped again, and she watched him doing the math in real time. The specific terrible math of a man who has been managing a story about a person and has just encountered the person and found the story and the person to be incompatible. Celine said a number of things, Evelina said. I have documentation of most of them. Celine moved. Not toward Evelina, toward the circle's edge, a fractional repositioning that looked like nothing but was the specific movement of a woman recalculating the geometry of a situation that had just inverted. Evelina tracked it in her peripheral vision without moving her eyes from Darius. "My son," Darius said. The word came out unguarded, the first thing he had said in this hall that hadn't been shaped by the room's observation of it. Just the word, stripped of everything. "Is healthy," she said, "and safe, and mine." The last word landed the way she meant it to, not as cruelty, not as a wound, but as an accurate statement of the current territorial reality. The child was hers. She had built him, protected him, provided everything he had ever needed, in a place his father had not known existed. That was not a judgment. It was simply a fact that had to be established before anything else could be established. Something moved through Darius's face. Deep, complicated, the expression of a man confronting the full weight of a consequence he had been protected from confronting for 3 years. Elder Cass's voice came across the hall with the dry authority of a man who had waded through stranger moments than this one. The formal matter, Cass said, would appear to be before the council. Evelina reached into the case at her side and withdrew the document. The ancient seal, the obsidian wolf, the territorial covenant in its full formal presentation. She held it up so the hall could see it. Under the Lycan territorial covenant, she said, I am invoking a claim before this council. Unlawful imprisonment of a seated Luna, evidence of external faction infiltration of Blackthorn Hollow's court, and the existence of an unacknowledged Lycan heir with blood right to the Blackthorn line. She lowered the document and looked at Cass. I'm requesting the council's formal hearing, immediately. The hall's response was the sound of 42 delegations processing a complete inversion of the political architecture they had arrived at this summit expecting to navigate. Celine's voice came from the edge of the circle, smooth and precisely calibrated, and carrying the specific quality of a woman who was performing composure over something that was no longer composed. These claims require substantiation, she said. A woman who vanished 3 years ago appearing with Silver Fang backing and a document doesn't constitute... I have the substantiation, Evelina said. She looked at Celine directly for the first time. Every record of the faction's operation in Blackthorn Hollow, every communication, 2 years of documented intelligence on the resource extraction, the council restructuring, the elimination of pack members who posed inconvenience to your operational timeline. A pause. Including the 3 who were killed in the lower cell block, who you told the king died in an accident. Darius went very still. Celine's composure held. She was extraordinary at holding composure. Evelina had known that from the beginning, had always found it the most dangerous thing about her, the way the surface stayed smooth even when the structure beneath it was failing. But there was something in her eyes now that Evelina had been watching for across the hall since she entered. The fractional shift of a woman who had planned for many scenarios and was now determining which of her contingencies still applied. The answer, Evelina understood in the same moment Celine understood it, was none of them. Darius, Celine turned to him. The smooth voice, the precise calibration, but different now, lower, stripped of the summit hall projection and addressed only to him, the specific intimacy of someone calling in a long-established debt. She's a Silver Fang operative. That document is fabricated. Everything she's claiming, the three from the lower block, Darius said. His voice was very quiet. You told me they died in the collapse. They did? Their names, he said. Celine stopped. You told me their names, he said. When you told me about the collapse, you gave me their names without my asking for them. He looked at her, and the hollow in his eyes had changed quality. Not filled, not resolved, but sharpened. The hollow of someone who has been in a dark room for a long time and has just found the edge of something. I didn't think about that until right now. Why would you have their names ready if it was an accident you'd only just learned about? The silence in the hall had the specific weight of a moment that everyone present understood they were going to remember. Celine looked at Darius for a long moment with the specific expression of a woman reassessing the utility of a resource that has become unpredictable. Then she reached into the fold of her formal coat, and the blade she produced was not the kind of blade you brought to a diplomatic summit. It was the kind you brought to an assassination. Corin moved, Evelina moved, every guard in the hall moved. Celine was fast. She had always been fast, which Evelina had always factored into her accounting. But fast alone was not sufficient when the room's geometry had turned entirely against you. She crossed the distance to Evelina not in a straight line, but at an angle, cutting through the circle's edge, using the initial confusion of movement to create a half-second of unclear targeting that was genuinely clever and genuinely almost worked. The blade came in low and left. Evelina moved right and used the momentum of the turn to drive her left forearm into Celine's extended wrist. The scar tissue that had healed visible and clean connecting with bone, absorbing the impact, and the blade skittered across the pavilion floor. Celine drove her elbow back. It connected with Evelina's jaw. Stars. Real ones. The kind that means structural impact has occurred and the body is registering damage. Evelina's footing broke for a half-second, and she corrected it with the specific muscle memory of 2 years of being knocked off balance in the practice yard and getting back up. They were close now. The kind of close where the combat had changed from a question of range and position to a question of who was willing to pay the most. Evelina looked at Celine across the space between them and saw, in Celine's eyes, the real calculation. Not the summit, not the faction's plan. The immediate survival logic of a woman who had just watched every piece of a 3-year operation collapse in real time and was now operating in the specific mode of someone with nothing left to protect, which made her more dangerous than she had been before, not less. Evelina knew this because she recognized it. Celine reached for a second blade, shorter, strapped to her forearm under the formal coat, the kind of detail that spoke to how thoroughly she had prepared for the possibility that this day ended in blood. She was 2 feet away and moving. Darius hit her from the side. Not a guard. Not Corin. Darius Vale, Alpha King of Blackthorn Hollow, with the specific force of a man who had been carrying 3 years of fury and guilt and hollow amber emptiness and had found, in the half-second of watching a blade come toward the woman he had sentenced to darkness, the only thing that cut through all of it cleanly. The impact took both of them to the pavilion floor. The struggle lasted 4 seconds. Celine was good. Darius was larger, faster, and past the point where any consideration of restraint was operating. The second blade went wide. The hall's guards converged. Celine was contained. Darius was on one knee, bleeding from the forearm where the short blade had connected before he took it, his chest heaving, his face the face of a man who has just done something irreversible and is still processing what it means. The hall was utterly silent. Evelina stood in the center of the circle with the ancient document still in her hand and her jaw registering the impact of Celine's elbow with a low, persistent throb, and she looked at Darius on the floor and she felt the full weight of everything that was true simultaneously. He had saved her from the blade. He had put her in the cell that had made the blade necessary. Elder Cass's voice came across the silent hall. "The council," Cass said, with the dry patience of a man who had seen a great many summits and had never seen one precisely like this one, "will convene formally to hear the claim." A pause. "It would appear the matter is substantiated." Darius looked up from the floor. His amber eyes found her across the pavilion with the specific quality of a man who has run out of things to hide behind and is standing in the open for the first time in a very long time. "Evelina," he said. She looked at him, the healer and the warrior and the mother and the queen and the woman who had pressed her bloody fingers against a dungeon wall and found a way through, all of it, the full weight of what 3 years had made her, looking at a man who had broken something that could not be repaired by saving her now. "The council is waiting," she said. She walked toward the convening chamber. Behind her she could hear Darius getting to his feet, and somewhere at the edge of the pavilion, in the controlled and guarded grip of Summit security, Celine Voss screamed one word, a name, a signal, the activation of whatever contingency she had prepared for the event of total exposure, and the sound of it carried across the plateau like a crack running through old stone. And every guard who had been holding the perimeter of the pavilion went down at once. The guards went down in sequence, not all at once. That was the first thing Evelina registered, because the sequence mattered. Not a single explosive charge, not a coordinated strike from outside the perimeter. Something internal. Someone inside the Summit security rotation who had been waiting for Celine's signal, which meant the contingency had been built into the operation long before today, which meant Celine had arrived at this summit already prepared for exposure. That was the quality of the enemy. Even in collapse, she had prepared the collapse. Evelina turned from the convening chamber entrance and moved back into the pavilion before the second guard hit the ground, not towards Celine. She scanned the pavilion's full geometry in the 3 seconds of maximum confusion and identified what mattered: the exits, the clustering of delegations, the location of Koran, the location of Darius, the direction the remaining armed presence was orienting toward. 6 figures in Summit security uniforms were moving inward from the pavilion's perimeter, not running. Moving with the controlled economy of people executing a plan that had a specific objective, which told her the objective was not general disruption. General disruption would have produced different movement. This was targeted. She was the target. Corin had already identified it. He came through the crowd of scrambling delegation members with the specific directness of a man cutting the shortest line between himself and a problem, and the 2 warriors he had brought from the Silverfang compound appeared from the delegation's left and right flanks without requiring instruction, which was the product of 3 years of working together distilled into 3 seconds of automatic response. "Chamber," Corin said, reaching her. "Now!" "Not yet." She was still reading the pavilion. "Where is—" She found him. Aldrich, Vera. A cold certainty had been accumulating at the back of her accounting since Selene had screamed the activation signal, because she understood Celine's operational logic well enough to know that the contingency would not be limited to the summit floor. The compound. Vera. Her son. She reached into the armor's inner layer and closed her fingers around the signal stone Corin had given her 3 weeks ago for exactly this category of eventuality. She pressed it once, hard. The stone heated in her palm, acknowledgement from the compound's receiving stone. And she held it until it cooled, which was the confirmation protocol. And then she held it for 1 more second anyway because the healer in her had always known that verification was not paranoia but practice. Then she moved. The 6 figures in security uniforms had reached the pavilion's inner ring. The nearest delegation members were scattering, which created a churning confusion of bodies that would simultaneously cover an obstacle. One of Corin's warriors went down. Not killed, she assessed from the quality of the fall, but incapacitated, which in combat was the same thing for the duration of this engagement. The lead figure cleared the last delegation member between itself and Evelina, and she saw the face under the uniform. A man she did not recognize, which was accurate, because she had memorized every face in Celine's documented network, and this one was not in the documentation, which meant he was a contingency resource held back specifically for this moment. He was fast. She was faster than she had been 3 years ago. That was the product of 1,200 hours of practice in the Silverfang yard, and the specific quality of a woman who had understood, on a fundamental level, that her survival and her son's survival were the same calculation. When you understand that, truly understand it without the soft edges of hope around it, the body finds reserves it did not know it was carrying. She moved inside his first strike and used his forward momentum against the geometry of his own balance. A technique Coran had spent 4 months making her understand was not about strength, but about reading the direction of committed force and being slightly ahead of it. He went sideways into the pavilion column, and the impact made a sound she did not examine because she was already addressing the second figure. The second one had a blade, real blade, long, the kind that spoke to someone who was not here to incapacitate. She heard Darius's voice from somewhere to her left, not words, a sound, the specific sound of a large dominant predator who has identified a threat to something it has decided to protect and is now past the deliberation phase of that decision. She did not have attention to allocate to the location of that sound right now. She trusted it to be useful. The blade came in a downward arc. She stepped into it. The counterintuitive move, the one that looked like the wrong choice and was in fact the only choice, when distance was closed and a longer weapon required room to generate force. She got her left forearm under the strike at the wrist, and the impact ran through the scar tissue and the bone beneath it with a quality she identified as significant but not structural, and she drove her right elbow into the figure's face with everything she had. He dropped. Corrin had the third. The Silver Fang warrior had the fourth. The remaining two had reoriented toward what they understood to be the easier target, which was the chaotic center of the pavilion where the delegations were attempting to reorganize themselves around a situation none of them had prepared for. And that reorientation told her that the six-person strike team had a hierarchy of objectives. She was primary, disruption was secondary, and secondary was what they were falling back on. Secondary was survivable. Primary had to be finished. She moved through the pavilion toward the two remaining figures with Quran on her right, and the geometry of the room working with her now because the delegations had cleared enough space that there was nothing to use as cover, and the two figures were visible and readable from across the distance. Elder Cass's voice came from somewhere above the chaos. The man had climbed, she realized, onto the base of one of the timber columns, the instinct of someone who had been in enough volatile situations to know that elevation was information, and the voice that came down from that elevation had the specific authority of a man who had been performing this function for longer than most people in the pavilion had been alive. Summit security, contain the perimeter, all delegations hold position. The response was not immediate. It was also not nothing. The trained security personnel who had not been Celine's contingency resources responded to the protocol command because protocol commands were what their bodies knew, and the partial restoration of order was enough to change the quality of the pavilion from active chaos to volatile stalemate. Evelina stopped. She assessed. Both remaining figures had stopped moving, not surrendering but calculating, the specific stillness of people who understand that the room's geometry has shifted against them and are running the numbers on the revised situation. She looked at them directly. "It's done," she said. Her voice carried the hall without effort. She had learned that from the hall itself, from the specific architecture of the pavilion and the way sound moved through it, the same architecture she had been reading since she entered. Whatever Celine offered you, the plan she built this around, look at the floor, look at your people down, count what's left. Silence. "It's done," she said again. Flat. Accurate. One of them set the blade down. After a half-second, the other followed. The summit's surviving security closed on them. In the pavilion's left corner, held by 3 guards with the specific controlled force of people who understand they are containing something that would like very much to continue, Celine Voss looked across the space at Evelina with an expression that had finally, completely shed its composure. What was underneath the composure was not rage. Rage would have been simpler, would have been the expression of a person responding to a loss. What was underneath was the expression of a person confronting the failure of a structure they had believed was complete, the specific quality of a kind of mind that plans everything and cannot easily locate itself inside the category of the unplanned. She was looking at Evelina the way a builder looks at a collapsed structure and tries to find where the calculation was wrong. Evelina looked back at her and felt nothing that required management. That, she understood, was what 3 years had built. Not the absence of feeling, but the specific calibration of feeling that did not require management. She felt what was true. Celine had tried to destroy her and had instead produced the exact conditions under which the version of herself standing in this pavilion had been built. That was not forgiveness. It was simply accurate. Darius was to her right. She had tracked his position through the engagement without looking directly at him, the way you tracked a wound's status without making it the center of your attention. Now she looked. He was standing at the edge of the cleared space, His forearm was bleeding from the blade contact in the earlier struggle. Not severely, she assessed automatically and without choosing to, the healer's instinct that had survived everything else intact. His chest was moving with the controlled cadence of someone managing the aftermath of high adrenaline. His amber eyes were on her. The hollow was still there. 3 years had not resolved it, but the quality of it had changed in the last hour in a way she could read. It had shifted from the hollow of someone who has completed a decision to the hollow of someone who has had a decision unmade and is standing in the space where the foundation used to be. She understood that feeling. She had stood in that exact space herself, in the dark, with bloody fingers and a child she was building her survival around, in a dungeon that should have ended her. That understanding did not change what was true, but it was accurate to hold it. Elder Cass descended from the column's base and crossed the pavilion floor with the unhurried movement of a man who had decided that the appropriate response to the last 20 minutes was to proceed with the business that had been interrupted by it. He stopped in the center of the cleared space and looked at Evelina and then at Darius and then at the document that was still, somehow, in Evelina's hand. She had held it through the entire engagement, she realized, the specific grip of a hand that had decided what it was carrying and did not let go of it. "The council," Cass said, "will convene in the formal chamber, immediately." His eyes moved around the pavilion with the encompassing quality of someone whose authority in this specific context was not performed but simply structural, like the load-bearing columns still standing around them. All 43 delegations are required to be present. What has occurred on this floor is a summit matter, not a bilateral matter, and it will be resolved as such. He looked at Evelina. "You'll present the claim." "Yes," she said. He looked at Darius. "Alpha King Vale, you'll answer to it." Darius said nothing for a moment. His eyes had not left Evelina. "Yes," he said. The formal chamber was cut from the same stone as the plateau itself, smaller than the pavilion, entirely enclosed, lit by torches and iron brackets along the walls, and a single long table of ancient timber that had been in this chamber for longer than any documentation could confirm. 43 delegations arranged themselves in tiered seating along the walls. The Silverfang delegation sat to the left of the presenting position. Blackthorn Hollow's remaining senior representatives, Darius and 2 council members who had made the summit journey, took the right. Celine was not present. Celine was in summit custody in a secured chamber on the plateau's opposite end, which was where she would remain until the council's disposition of her case. Evelina stood at the presenting position, and she laid out everything. She did it the way she did everything, completely, sequenced correctly, without decoration. The faction's operational history in Blackthorn Hollow, documented and dated. The fabrication of the evidence that had been used to imprison her, with the specific technical analysis of the handwriting replication that Fenn had produced in the compound's second year using samples from Celine's own correspondence. The intelligence on the pack members who had been eliminated, including the 3 from the lower cell block, whose names Darius had asked Celine for, and whose deaths had not been accidents. The documentation of the resource extraction, the kingdom's accounts, the loyalty restructuring, the systematic dismantling of the infrastructure that a pack depended on its court to maintain. She presented all of it without looking at Darius. Not from avoidance, from accuracy. The presentation was for the council, and the council required her full attention. When she had finished the evidentiary presentation, she paused and let the chamber process what it had been given. 43 delegations in varying states of response, some urgent, some cold, some calculating the implications for their own kingdoms with the specific focus of people who have just recognized a threat they had not previously identified as such. Then she looked at Darius. "Alpha King Vale has one question to answer before this council," she said. "Not the question of Celine Voss's actions. Those are documented, and the council's determination on them is its own process." She held his gaze across the chamber. "The question before the council is what he knew, and when he knew it, and what he chose when he was given the choice." The chamber waited. Darius looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Elder Cass. "I'll answer the council directly," he said. Cass nodded. What followed was the most painful thing Evelina had witnessed in 3 years, which was significant given what the 3 years had contained. Not because Darius lied. He didn't. That was the thing she had not been certain of, the variable she had been unable to fully predict. Because the man who had stood in the granite hall and said the evidence is sufficient had been someone she no longer had confident knowledge of. She had not known, until he stood in front of the council and opened his mouth, whether he had become someone who would continue to perform the version of himself that Celine had spent 3 years constructing. He hadn't. He told the council what he knew, which was limited. She had understood, from the intelligence reports, that Celine had managed his knowledge carefully, that his culpability was less the culpability of a man who had known the full truth and chosen it, and more the culpability of a man who had chosen not to look. He told them about the evidence presented to him, the council verification, the decision he had made in the granite hall with the hollow amber eyes that had already decided before Evelina walked in. He told them about the 3 years, the reports he had received about the dungeon collapse that he had accepted without the questions that the quality of the report should have prompted in a man paying attention, the gradual narrowing of his own council access that he had explained to himself as efficiency rather than as the architecture of someone removing his ability to see. The decisions Celine had steered him toward that he had allowed himself to believe were his own. He did not ask for sympathy. He presented himself the way an accurate witness presents a case, with the specific quality of someone who has already assessed the damage and understands that what the council does with the assessment is not something he can control. When he finished, there was a silence in the chamber that had the quality of the silence after something structural has changed. Elder Cass spoke the council's deliberation into order, and the chamber cleared for the formal session. Evelina waited in an anteroom with Koran and the remaining Silver Fang warrior while the 43 delegations worked through the disposition. The signal stone in her armor warmed once. The compounds confirm, Aldrich secure, Vera's rotation intact, no contact from Celine's people. She pressed the stone and breathed and did not let the breath shake. "You held the document through the entire fight," Koran said. She looked at her hand. "Yes." "I counted. You took down 2 of the 6 while holding a legal document." She looked at him. He was not smiling exactly. Koran's face was not built for smiling exactly. But something in the gray quartz eyes had the quality of a man finding something genuinely worth noting. "The document mattered," she said. "Letting go of it would have been the wrong signal." He looked at her for a moment. 3 years ago," he said, "in that passage, when I told you to trust me, I had about 60% certainty you would." A pause. "I have a much higher certainty now." She held his gaze. "That's not a compliment. That's just accurate." "Yes," he said. "That's why it counts." The council's deliberation ran for 2 hours. When the chamber doors opened and the delegations filed back in, she read the room before she read Elder Cass's expression, and what she read was the specific configuration of a group of people who have agreed on something that costs them something to agree on. Elder Cass stood at the head of the long timber table. "This council finds," he said, "sufficient and documented evidence of unlawful imprisonment of a seated Luna. Sufficient and documented evidence of external faction infiltration of a member kingdom's court constituting a violation of the Territorial Covenant's mutual security provisions. And confirmed existence of an unacknowledged Lycan heir with blood right to the Blackthorn line." He paused. "Under the ancient Lycan Territorial Covenant, these findings collectively constitute grounds for the claim as presented." The chamber waited. The council's disposition is as follows. Celine Voss and the surviving members of her faction's summit operation will be remanded to the council's joint custody for full accounting of the faction's activities across all affected territories. Blackthorn Hollow's kingdom title will be reviewed for transfer under the Covenant's provisions for wrongful dispossession of a Luna. Cass looked at Darius. "Alpha King Vale. The council is prepared to hear your position on the transfer before finalizing its determination." Darius stood. He was still bleeding slightly from the forearm. Someone had wrapped it with a basic field dressing, but it needed proper attention, she noted. The wound was deeper than the surface presentation suggested, and the field dressing was not correctly applied for the location of the cut relative to the underlying tendon. She noted this and set it aside. "Not now." He stood in front of 43 delegations, and he looked at Evelina, and his face had the specific quality of a man who has found, at the bottom of everything, something true, and is holding it without knowing yet what to do with it. "I have no position on the transfer," he said. "The claim is valid. What I did, what I allowed, cost more than a title can account for." His voice was even. Not performed evenness, not the managed certainty of a man protecting his throne, just the voice of someone saying what was true. The kingdom is hers, by law, and by everything else that matters more than law. The chamber's silence had the quality of something settling. Cass nodded once. The council's determination stands, he said. The formal session closed at sundown. The plateau outside the chamber filled with the activity of 43 delegations processing the day's events and preparing for the summit's continuation, because the work of territorial governance did not stop because one kingdom's power structure had been publicly dismantled. The work continued. It always continued. Evelina stood outside the chamber door and let the evening air reach her. Cold, clean, with the metallic quality of the border territory that she had learned to associate with the Silverfang lands and had, at some point without marking the exact moment, begun to associate with the feeling of being where she was supposed to be. She heard him before he spoke. His footfall, behind her and to the right, with the specific quality of a man who was choosing to approach slowly enough to be heard rather than arriving in her peripheral vision unannounced. A consideration she had not expected from him, and which she filed without assigning it more weight than it carried. "I need to clean that wound properly," she said without turning. A pause. "I know," he said. She turned. He was 6 feet away, which was the distance of someone who had decided not to close the remaining space without permission, and she read that correctly as a decision rather than as hesitation. He looked at her in the evening light, not the pavilion, not the chamber, not the compressed, urgent spaces of the day's events, but here, in the open air, with the summit's activity around them and the sky going dark over the territorial borderlands. He looked at her the way she had looked at him across the pavilion when she first registered his presence, complete, direct, not managing the looking. "You kept the child alive," he said. "Yes." "Kept him? Healthy, safe, while I—" He stopped, started differently. "What you built, what you did with 3 years that I put you in a dungeon to take from you, He stopped again. She waited, not to be cruel, because he was finding the words that were actually true and that took longer than the words that were merely adequate. "I don't have language for it," he said finally. "There isn't language for what I owe. I know that. I'm not standing here because I think there's a transaction available." He held her gaze. "I'm standing here because you're the only person in my life who has ever required me to actually be honest. And I've spent 3 years running from what that cost both of us, and I'm done running." She looked at him for a long moment. The healer in her, the warrior, the woman who had pressed her hands against a dungeon wall and found a way through. All of it present, none of it requiring performance. "Aldrich," she said. Something moved in his face, something that had been braced for what she might say and had not prepared for what she actually said. "He has your jaw," she said. "He's healthy, and he's growing, and he's not afraid of anything, which is going to require some management as he gets older." A pause. "He has a right to know who his father is, not as a king, not as a title, as the man who was honest, in the end, when it cost him everything to be honest." She held his gaze. "I'll decide the terms of that. If you can accept that those terms are mine to set, fully mine, without negotiation, then we can discuss what comes next." He absorbed this. She watched him do it, not the fast processing of a man looking for the angle in what he'd been told, but the slower work of someone genuinely reckoning with a condition that had no loophole in it. "Yes," he said. "I mean it," she said. "There's no version of this where you reclaim something. No version where the last 3 years are balanced by what happened today. Aldrich knowing you is a different thing from you having a position in what I'm building. Those are separate questions, and I'm not answering the second one tonight." "I'm not asking for the second one," he said. "I'm asking to know my son." She looked at him for another long moment. "I'll send word to the compound," she said. "You'll come when I've prepared him for it, which means when I judge he's ready, not when the calendar is convenient." "Understood." "And Darius," she held his eyes, "if you ever, in any situation, for any reason, make a decision about him that's yours to make without coming to me first, I will remove you from his life completely, and it will be permanent, and it will be correct. That's not a threat. It's the operating principle." He held her gaze. His amber eyes had changed quality again. Something in them that she had not seen before. which was the expression of a man who is being told the truth by someone who has earned the right to tell it, and who is recognizing, perhaps for the first time, what it actually feels like to be held to a genuine standard rather than simply to a fear. "Understood," he said. She nodded once. Then she reached out and took his forearm, the wounded one, the field-dressed cut, and turned it over with the matter-of-fact directness of a healer doing what healers do. And she examined the dressing with the specific attention of someone who has already diagnosed the problem and is now confirming what she expects to find. "This needs proper treatment," she said. "Tonight. The placement is wrong relative to the tendon, and if it stays dressed like this through the night, you'll have restriction in the fingers by morning." He was very still while she examined it, not from discomfort. "I know," he said again. "Come to the Silverfang camp in an hour. Fen will see to it. He's better than I am with blade wounds, as much as that still bothers me to admit." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. The beginning of the shape that might become one, someday, if the man wearing the face had enough time and enough truth to work with. She released his arm and walked back toward the Silverfang camp. She did not look back. She was done looking back. Blackthorn Hollow, when she returned to it 6 weeks later as its queen rather than its prisoner, was smaller than she remembered. Not in dimension. The black spires and the pale granite and the iron wolf-jaw brackets were exactly as she had left them. The physical record of a place that had not changed because stone doesn't change the way people do. But in the quality of the hold it had over her. She had thought, in various moments over 3 years, that the return would feel one of several things: triumph, or grief, or the specific bitter satisfaction of a reckoning long prepared. What she felt, walking through the castle gates with Corin at her right and Vera at her left, and the 43 Summit delegation's formal recognition of her claim preceding her, was something simpler and more accurate than any of those. She felt competent. She felt equipped. She felt like a woman who understood the problem in front of her and had the specific skills the problem required and was prepared to begin. The pack members who lined the entrance road were a study in the particular expression of people who have been managed into one loyalty and are now recalibrating in real time. She read them the way she had read every room she had entered for 3 years, quickly, completely, without the softening lens of wanting to see something different from what was there. She saw fear, which was accurate. She saw the specific wariness of a pack that had been systematically taught to be wary of its own leadership. She saw, in some faces, the older ones, the ones she recognized from 11 years of healing work, something that was trying to become relief but hadn't yet confirmed it had permission. She looked at those faces and she let them see her, not the armor, not the crown, though both were present and both were correct. Her. The woman who had organized her stores in an alcove off the healing chamber and who had stitched 7 inches of muscle in a winter forest and who had pressed her hands against dungeon stone and kept looking for the way through. She walked through the gates of Blackthorn Hollow and she did not slow down. The first 3 months were the work. Not the political work. That was ongoing, was always ongoing. The disposition of Celine's faction and the restructuring of the council and the accounting of what had been taken from the kingdom's resources and what could be recovered and what was simply gone. That work required attention and precision, and she gave it both. But it was not the work she meant when she thought about the first 3 months. The work she meant was the pack itself. She walked the pack's residential sections on foot, without ceremony, in the early mornings before the administrative day demanded her. Not to be seen, or not only to be seen, to see. To know again who lived where and what they needed and where the gaps were in the infrastructure that Celine's management had allowed to deteriorate. She had healers to deploy. Fen had come with her, and 2 others from the Silverfang compound who had agreed to the transition and whose skills she trusted. She set them to the most urgent work immediately, and she walked, and she looked, and she remembered what it meant to actually know the place you were responsible for. The elder packman's wound had never properly healed. She found him in the 2nd week of walking, living with his daughter's family in the pack's northeastern section, his left hand carrying the persistent tremor that she had been afraid of when she examined the original wound and which 3 years of inadequate treatment had confirmed. She sat with him for 2 hours on a cold morning in his daughter's kitchen, and she worked on the hand with the full range of what 3 years in the Silverfang Empire had added to her knowledge. And she told him honestly what she could restore and what had calcified past restoring. and he looked at her across the kitchen table with the expression of a man who had been told the truth by his healer and found it worth considerably more than 3 years of being told comfortable, inadequate things. "You came back," he said. "Yes," she said. "Didn't think you would." He looked at his hand, at her work on it. "Thought you'd have better sense." "Probably should have," she said. "But the work is here." He looked at her for a moment. Then he made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh, the sound of a man who has lived long enough to find a certain comedy in the persistence of the competent. "The work is here," he agreed. Aldrich came to Blackthorn Hollow when she had been there 2 months, and the basic security of the palace had been rebuilt around the specific requirements of protecting a Lycan heir rather than managing a king's paranoia. He was 3 years old, and he arrived at the castle gates in Vera's arms with the specific confidence of a child who had grown up in a place where the largest and most powerful beings in his world had treated him as worth protecting, and who had therefore concluded that the world was, on balance, manageable. She watched him come through the gates, and she felt the specific quality of feeling that had no name except the most accurate name, which was, "This is why." Not the kingdom, not the title, not the corrective satisfaction of having rebuilt what had been taken. This, the child who was walking now, would run, soon, would be unstoppable, with Darius's jaw and her hands and eyes that had a silver quality in certain light that was entirely and specifically his own. Darius came the following week. She had sent word when she judged it correct, not when the calendar was convenient, exactly as she had told him, and he had waited without requiring her to justify the timeline, which was the first evidence that he had understood the operating principle and was actually living by it rather than simply accepting it as a condition to be tolerated. She met him at the castle's secondary entrance rather than the gates, which was not a statement of diminishment, but a statement of accuracy. He was not arriving as the Alpha King. He was arriving as a man who had asked to know his son, and the entrance appropriate to that was the one that said, "This is what you are here for, and it is both less than what you had and more important than what you lost." He was thinner than he had been at the summit. The exile had done what exile does. It had stripped the performance from him. The particular quality of a man who had spent his entire life in a position that required performance and was now living without the requirement. She did not know if he would find something else to build with the self that remained under the performance. That was not her calculation to make. He stopped inside the secondary entrance and he looked at her in the diffuse interior light with the amber eyes that she had spent 3 years learning to think about as simply Aldrich's eyes rather than his father's eyes, and he said nothing for a moment. "How is he?" he said. "Well," she said. "Come." She led him through the castle's interior corridors to the room she had set aside for Aldrich's quarters, not the royal nursery, which carried the specific history of a place that had been built around the expectations of a different life, but a new room in the castle's eastern section, with a window that looked toward the tree line and a floor that a 3-year-old with Lycan speed could run across without risk of the furniture arrangements that would stop him. Aldrich was sitting with Vera in the room's center, examining something small in his hands. A piece of the silver mineral stone from the Silver Fang compound that Corin had given him when they left, which had become the primary object of a 3-year-old's comprehensive investigative attention. He looked up when the door opened. He looked at Darius with the direct and fearless consideration of a child who has been taught, by the company he grew up in, that large and powerful things in his vicinity were worth examining rather than retreating from. Darius looked at his son for the first time, and the expression that moved through his face was not something Evelina had any name for and did not attempt to name. It was the expression of a man confronting a consequence that was not a punishment, a consequence that was alive and healthy and holding a piece of silver stone and looking back at him with amber eyes and the specific stubborn jaw of 3 generations of Vale men. "Hi," Aldrich said, flat, informational. The greeting of a 3-year-old who had not yet learned to make social sound that cost nothing. "What's that?" He pointed at the bandaged forearm, which was by now properly dressed and correctly placed relative to the tendon. Darius cleared his throat. "An old wound." Aldrich considered this for a moment with the complete seriousness that 3-year-olds brought to investigation. "Mama fixes wounds," he said. He held out the silver stone. "You can have this. It's a fixing stone." Something in the room shifted. The quality of air, or light, or the specific gravity of the moment. She couldn't name it more accurately than that. Vera was looking at the tree line through the window with the studied discretion of a woman who had decided to be elsewhere in every way she could manage while remaining physically present. Darius reached out and took the stone from his son's small hand with the careful quality of someone holding something they understand to be genuinely valuable and genuinely fragile. "Thank you," he said. His voice was different from any voice she had heard him use, stripped of every register except the one for something true. Aldrich regarded him for another moment. "You can sit down," he said, with the magnanimous generosity of a host who has determined that a guest is acceptable. Then he turned back to Vera and said something about the stone's probable qualities with the complete attention of a child who had delivered his verdict and returned to his primary interest. Darius sat on the floor. Evelina stood in the doorway, and she watched her son explain the properties of Silver Fang mineral to a man who had once commanded the largest pack in the Northern Territories, who was now sitting cross-legged on the floor of a room in a castle that was no longer his, listening with the specific quality of someone for whom every word mattered more than anything he had spent the last 3 years on. She turned and walked back down the corridor. The work was still waiting. It was always still waiting. The council session at midday, the accounts review with Bren, who had come from the Empire to help oversee the restructuring, the follow-up on the faction's secondary network that Koran was still dismantling in the border territories, the Elder Packman's follow-up treatment in 3 days, the healer's infrastructure she was rebuilding from the foundation up, because a kingdom's capacity to care for its people was not a secondary concern to be addressed after the political architecture was settled. It was the political architecture. It was the point of the thing. It had always been the point of the thing. She walked back through her castle, accurate and still strange, and she let herself acknowledge, once and completely, the full weight of what she had done. Not the claim, not the council, not the summit's formal determination. What she had done in the dungeon, in the passage, in 3 years of deliberate rebuilding. What she had chosen every single morning to get up and continue becoming when it would have been understandable, would have been human, to stop. She had not stopped. Not because she was exceptional in any way that separated her from everyone else who had been put in a dark place by someone with more power and less accountability. Not because she had a gift for surviving that others lacked, but because she had understood, from the bottom of a dungeon floor with her hands flat against cold stone, that the distance between where she was and where she needed to be was made entirely of choices, and she had made them, each one separately, in order, without waiting until she could see the end before she took the next step. The castle around her was full of work. Ahead of her, outside the eastern window, she could see through the corridor's narrow glass. The tree line stood against the morning sky, silver gray and still and old, exactly as it had always stood. She walked toward it. Years later, 5 or 7, or enough that Aldrich had grown past her shoulder and was beginning to carry the specific quality of the Silver Fang compound in his movement, the unhurried readiness of someone who had learned what he was capable of and was not yet done learning. Visitors to Blackthorn Hollow said the same thing in different words. They said, "The kingdom is different." Not the architecture, not the spires, not the pale granite floors, something in the quality of the people, something in the way the pack moved through its own streets without the low-register wariness of people managing the constant proximity of unpredictable authority. It was not that the kingdom was easy, or that the queen was soft. She was not soft. The council worked harder under her management than it had in the previous generation, and the pack's accountability structures were more demanding rather than less. But the work was visible. The purpose of it was visible. And the woman at the center of it was known, not as a title, not as a story, but as someone who had walked these corridors and sat in these kitchens and put her hands on the specific problems of specific people with the direct attention of someone who understood that authority without responsibility was just noise. They asked her, sometimes, the newer council members, the pack's younger generation, the occasional delegation from a neighboring kingdom learning how the restructuring had been accomplished. They asked what the turning point was, what the moment was when she had decided to become what she had become. She gave different versions of the answer at different times, because the honest answer was that there had not been a single moment. There had been a dungeon floor and a child and a stone that moved a quarter inch, and a man with gray quartz eyes in a dark passage, and there had been Marta asking how she was standing, and Fenn's careful hands on herb bundles in a compound kitchen, and Vera at the edge of a campfire looking at the middle distance with the studied discretion of a woman who had made her own way through her own dark and understood exactly what that cost. There had been Aldrich's first steps and first words, and the way he said mama with the specific confidence of a child who knew, without any doubt, that the person he was saying it to would answer. There had been every choice, every morning, to get up. If she gave any single answer at all, she said this: "A queen is not made by the moment someone gives you a crown. A queen is made by every moment you refuse to stay on the floor." She said it without drama. She said it the way she said everything, with the flat precision of a woman naming what was true. And then she went back to work. Darius Vale wandered the border territories for 7 years before he stopped wandering. She heard of him occasionally through Coron's network, not in the form of intelligence reports, but in the form of Coron saying, over a council meeting's end, that a certain border pack had a healer's assistant. Now, older man, knows wound treatment better than most people who haven't been trained formally. She listened to this, and she held it for a moment, and she let it settle into the specific place where she kept the true accounting of things, and then she moved to the next item on the agenda. He had taken the silver stone with him. Aldrich had told her this at 5 years old, with the matter-of-fact reporting quality that she recognized as her own, and which she found she did not mind at all. "He took my fixing stone," Aldrich said, not upset, reporting. "Yes," she said. Her son thought about this for a moment with the serious consideration he brought to everything. "Good," he said. He needed it more. She looked at him. His amber eyes in her hands, and the specific quality of someone who had grown up surrounded by the kind of competence that doesn't announce itself and had absorbed it without being told to. "Yes," she said. He did. Outside the eastern window, the tree line stood against the morning. The kingdom moved through its day. The work waited. She went to meet it.